The 2025 budget has introduced major developments in the energy sector, and in this special episode, we deep dive into the key announcements, their implications, and what lies ahead for India's energy mission. Joining us are two distinguished experts, Professor Satya and Seshadri, who is the head and faculty in charge of the Energy Consortium, and Dr. Nikhil Tambe, who is the CEO of Energy Consortium. Together, they'll break down the highlights of Budget 2025. Before we get started, let me give a quick overview. We had our Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman present the annual budget a few days back, and there were a lot of new initiatives announced across the board. There were new schemes for the MSME sector, for the education sector, for import and export, for women, for farmers, and so on. But in today's podcast, our focus will be on India's energy mission. Before we do a deep dive, Nikhil, I want you to share your initial thoughts on the budget, because for someone who's been working in the energy domain for years now, is this an exciting budget or how do you see it?
Thank you, Srivatsan. It is indeed an exciting budget. In fact, the way I would classify this is it's a consistent budget. I've been tracking this for the last 2-3 years very closely, and what I see is this budget builds on what was done in the previous budget. So specifically, last budget gave energy a very significant spot in the overall national priorities. Energy became one of the 9 priority areas from a fiscal outlay point of view. That's very important. That continues. Energy security has been identified not just as a national security challenge, but it's a core challenge towards our growth and development. So from that point of view also, this budget is extremely promising. There are a number of things which I'm sure we'll discuss, but which lay the emphasis on manufacturing, indigenization of technologies, and giving the right boost to all sectors, not just the heavy industries, but even at the grassroots level. So that's what excites me. I've now, by the way, specifically speaking, I've seen a lot of outlays being made in say hydrogen, in terms of viability gap funding for batteries and energy storage for grid. We don't have those kind of same outlays announced this year. But to me, the previous ones were multi-year outlays, and this budget kind of just continues on that promise which the government has already made. So again, that's why I call this as a consistent budget. Another exciting part of this budget is there are some new additions, and I hope we will cover them today. But these were muted in the past, particularly the nuclear one, for example. There's a talk about having a mission setup. This was not a topic of necessarily public domain discussion. It was, for whatever reasons, relegated to scientific discourse or private and confidential conversations. But there's an increasing undercurrent which I sense from discussions with industry members on how critical nuclear is to the overall decarbonization journey itself. So when I see these different things, I think my main takeaway is a lot of excitement in energy. And as somebody who works in this field, I see a lot of promise for future jobs coming up in the industry as well.
Okay, let me quickly jump to Professor Satya. Professor Satya, the budget has announced National Manufacturing Mission under Make in India to boost domestic manufacturing across industries. One of the key focus is on clean tech manufacturing, which again reinforces India's commitment towards climate-friendly development. This initiative is set to improve domestic value addition and strengthen the ecosystem for solar PV cells, EV batteries, motors, wind turbines, and so on. My question to you is, what will be the implications of this initiative to accelerate India's energy transition?
Thank you. I think this is a great initiative if we look at it from the context of Indian MSME manufacturing capability. So they have come up quite well by catering to largely export-oriented manufacturing, such as the automotive sector, for example. And many such metal manufacturing has really picked up. And with recent focus on battery manufacturing and localization of components required for battery, I believe this lays out a very clear path. And over the period of last year or so, the government has also reduced the basic customs duty on components that are related to the energy systems manufacturing. Now, what we need to see happen here is translation of these initiatives into action, some of which could happen by working with institutions like IIT and the National Institute of Design and multiple such technology-driven institutions to look at how much and what could be done for improvement in localization, primarily driven through design, engineering, and also looking at material availability and see what kind of local content in manufacturing can be enhanced. This is also driven by the fact that so far Indian manufacturing, particularly the MSME sector, have been job shops, which I mean they knew where to get the drawings from, or they provided drawings by a particular MNC or a large company and they make it to specifications. Now what we see and what we expect to happen is many of these companies that have the manufacturing capability to go into design and product development in collaboration with institutions such as ours, so that it could enable them become more value-added service providers and solutions providers to the market at large.
So one of the main highlights of the budget was power sector reforms, and the finance minister has announced incentives for electricity distribution reforms and the implementation of intra-state transmission capacity by states. This is said to improve the financial health and capacity of electricity companies. Nikhil, your thoughts on this effort and who are the main beneficiaries of this initiative?
So power sector reforms are also another big area of I would say pain point in the past, and the main reason for that is we have moved significantly away from our traditional base of fossil fuels, coal and thermal plants to a lot more of renewable energy. Just this year, MNRE has announced that we've crossed 200 gigawatts in renewable energy already. We are on track to reaching 500 gigawatts soon by 2030. And these sources of renewable energy are not continuous energy supplies. So we see a lot of variance during the day, during the season. And for the grid to become acceptable to this has been the main challenge. It's good that now we are shifting. I mean, we always knew that this would be a challenge, but technically we are experiencing it and now, trying to work more on that. So the power sector reforms, particularly when they look at how renewable can be integrated more easily, is important. Also, there's going to be a lot of energy storage. Like I mentioned, there was already an outlay for viability gap funding for energy storage, which is batteries for the grid. So that is also going to help the power sector, but we need right reforms. And the last aspect why these reforms are important is the end beneficiaries. For example, we've seen a boom in the electric vehicle sector. There's a lot more two-wheelers, four-wheelers, even EV buses that now we can see on the roads. This trend is only going to grow. We have made some internal estimations of this, and a study is underway in our group on how the EVs can become a core source. Right now they are a kind of disruption for the power grid, but they can become a core source for how to improve the grid itself. And what we basically hypothesize is we are seeing about 30 gigawatt hours of batteries that are already on the roads, and a projection even in normal case scenarios shows us that this may increase to 200 gigawatt hours of batteries on the road. Now if I compare this with what the Central Electricity Authority has proposed as what battery energy storage systems we need to have, they have proposed 200. So the numbers are similar, and we are trying to study how to make this an asset, how to make the EVs an asset for the grid rather than a strain on it as we anticipate it if we don't work on it well. So these end sectors, those which are starting to adopt solar heavily, so these are MSMEs, these are industries, in their appetite to decarbonize, they've started putting up a lot of in-house renewable. So these sectors will benefit as a result of power sector reforms. Also, power sector reforms will bring in a lot of harmonization between the grid on a national level and individual states, particularly between the distribution companies at the state level and the central grid. And there's already discussions that I have participated in at a CII forum last year, where we heard from the Tamil Nadu state government energy secretary as well as TANGEDCO, who are talking about how they are preparing for this specific purpose. So we are seeing some reforms on the state level. We are expecting a lot more cohesive and harmonized reforms happening on a central level very soon, and they will, like I said, be because of renewable energy, because of energy storage coming into the grid and because of all the EVs that we have on the roads.
There also seems to be a lot of emphasis on MSME sector to adopt new technology to explore opportunities related to exports. Given the fact that you've been involved in a lot of efforts focused on MSME, could you talk a little bit about how this year's budget will help the MSME sector?
So when it comes to MSME, there are three things that drive them. One, by definition, they are small. Right now, the number has increased. The overall definition of MSMEs have increased to include a large number that are at a capacity where they could now start scaling. So previously, the definition of MSME was a little bit restrictive, and given the global context, their size was kind of a limitation. Now, I think by revising the definition, a fair amount of companies which has the financial wherewithal to invest in new technologies and invest in solutions that could be deployed worldwide and that could also adopt the global best practices has come in. The second thing is, given that the MSME sector is also a feeder sector into a large set of industries, and given the focus on ESG or the related regulations on sustainability, adopting efficient manufacturing processes, cleaner sources of energy, and also becoming more digitally oriented, primarily by digitalization and bringing in productivity gains through deployment of technologies such as IoT, and eventually using solutions such as machine learning and artificial intelligence to boost the productivity is something they could do. So essentially, our MSME has now an opportunity to reinvent by deploying what's the best in the world, because we are building out the manufacturing base ground up again for the world, and could be great to seize this opportunity to put in the best of technologies for manufacturing, the best of energy sources, and bringing in the digital solutions to physical world that could boost both employability and productivity of these companies.
So my last question is related to IIT Madras. To support India's energy transition, the budget introduces something called Nuclear Mission for Viksit Bharat, targeting nearly 100 gigawatts of nuclear energy by 2047. To facilitate private sector participation, amendments are also being made. Additionally, a nuclear energy mission with nearly 20,000 crore outlay is set to drive R&D in SMRs, with at least 5 indigenous SMRs operational by 2033. How do you see this announcement, and will the Energy Consortium be part of this?
So I'll allow my colleague Professor Satya Seshadri to elaborate on some specific efforts that are underway at IIT Madras on this topic. But few things that I will emphasize is we have, as Energy Consortium, been engaged in the national discourse on nuclear, specifically through SMR discourse. How we have done this is we've participated in working group meetings which were held on the sidelines of G20. So there was one specifically on SMRs that we have participated and represent the consortium. It has been very clear to us during the last year and a half that we are part of these activities, that the nuclear sector is going to become important for decarbonizing, and to enable that, the government is willing, through the appropriate agencies, to involve the private sector. So there's a large element of bringing in private sector now in. Even the budget talks about this. It talks about how to make this part of the civil liabilities, how to make sure that the uses are for civilian purposes, and how to basically draw the line between what's the core nuclear aspect and what's the aspect where a private sector can interface. So there's discourse that we are tapping into as it happens. From an end industrial engagement point of view, we actually already have one of our first partners with whom we have established an NDA just a month back, and this is more on how to maximize the power generated from a small, or what we are calling a micro modular reactor. We anticipate these applications could be as simple as data centers. There's a growing demand of data centers in the country. There's a growing grouping of global capability centers, or GCCs, that's also coming up. In fact, the government has also promised a separate set of guidelines for how GCCs can be set up, because again they see a lot of these coming up. These are going to be, in our opinion, applications for this, particularly the data centers, which is a growing market, and India needs to have a lot of server capability on our own soil for a variety of other reasons. And when we look at uninterrupted, reliable, secure and safe power supply for this, I think we are going to see some very innovative uses of nuclear. And in that perspective, the Energy Consortium is actually looking very excitedly towards this. We are getting queries from some of our existing members and other industry partners, and we are trying to overall put a strategy on where we can partner. So currently that is more on converting ultimately the energy from nuclear has to be converted into electrical energy. So we are looking forward to partnering with industry members, and stay tuned for more details on what happens in this area.
This has come at a great time because the Energy Consortium about a year back kind of identified nuclear to be an area of explosive growth for India. This is driven by the fact that there needs to be a solution that replaces coal as a baseload energy solution, and as far as we know, nuclear is one of the best clean energy baseload solution that is available. But the traditional way of doing nuclear, which is large reactors supported by large exclusion zones, is a non-starter, primarily from variety of reasons, but the most basic is it requires displacement of communities, which is not going to happen. The small modular reactor, which currently is being envisaged by the government, is of typically a 100 to 200 megawatt size range, which is called the Bharat modular reactor, which is again, I would say, version which could support smaller communities as such, and maybe some industries. At IIT Madras, we have taken it one level lower, where we are currently conceptualizing and working on what we call as a micro modular reactor. Imagine a data center or a commercial building like IIT Madras Research Park or an institution like the main campus, requiring about 10 megawatt connected load and 70 megawatt hours every day. Could be self-sufficient, generating its own clean power, the waste heat that could be utilized for driving potentially additional energy generation, including cooling and heating, and becoming completely self-reliant for both base load and peak load kind of operations on campus. That's the kind of vision we have. And the other thing that will also follow is, because once these designs are made and these designs are kind of licensed, this will enable large number of private capital to go after and setting up large number of manufacturing of these reactors. And this we have already started seeing in our space. Once the space sector was deregularized, you now see a lot of private capital going in the space sector, and it's now really leading to a point where entrepreneurs across the country are building what probably a decade ago would never have been thought of. And I see something similar happening in the nuclear, and given that India has its own 3-stage nuclear program, and there's a lot of development that could be aligned to go with the 3 stages, I could see quite, I would say, in the mid to long term being completely sufficient in terms of both fuel cycle, but also the technology that can lead to this net zero carbon growth.
On that note, we have come to the end of this podcast. Thank you, Professor Satya and Nikhil, for taking the time out to answer all our questions related to India's energy mission.